I do think that no esports team should be purely an esports team. They have to diversify in some way.
Parth, how you doing?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's an exciting day for you. You announced your new firm. Why don't you kind of give a breakdown of kind of what it is?
Sure. So after leaving TSM, I was kind of thinking about what I really wanted to do. And I had three different options in front of me. I could either go work in another esports org. I could start my own venture, but that comes with a lot of like operational cost in terms of setting things up and all that. So what I did was I was consulting for a group of investors, and they like we were chatting for a while, and they said like, hey, if you wanted to build out a project, what would you do? And so it's kind of like a two-part thing where I'm still working for them, but I get some funding to kind of tackle some of the projects on the esports side that I've always wanted to address. So it's going to be part consultancy where I'm going to be working with some pro teams, collegiate and high school programs to kind of build out their programs. And I'm also looking at a project on the data side because right now I think performance metrics across the board in esports aren't really analyzed or used in any meaningful way to create training programs. And so I thought for at least the next year or two, I could kind of delve in deeper. I have some background on the stat side, but we're going to take more of a Bayesian statistical approach compared to some of the ML and AI that we see in the space right now,
Yep.
and see what we can do with it. So I basically have 2 years at least of working on cool projects in the space that otherwise I don't think I would have been able to.
So what do some of those projects look like? You know, you're kind of like talking about sort of general interests, but what are some of those
Mhm.
like specific things you're wanting to achieve now with this?
Yeah, for sure. Um, so I think that at a broader level, right? I think when you look at the industry, a lot of the problems you see on the pro side, both in terms of stability, kind of comes from at least from me, comes from there being a lot of investment in the pros on the professional side, but the industry underneath kind of not keeping pace. So if things like collegiate aren't really built out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work for at least one collegiate program next year and see like can we set up like a very baseline model of what a college need, like what are the KPIs for a collegiate program look like? Uh, what kind of time scale does it take for a college to go from like zero to running a program to the point where they are actually getting value out of it? How to retain talent? How to work in an industry where publishers and their working relationship with colleges are still like fairly nebulous and the landscape is constantly changing. So helping colleges understand the value of esports and building out their programs in this current landscape is like one project. Another project is there's a lot of different pockets of high schools and just communities across the US. So I'm probably going to work with one or two and see like, hey, how does a principal of a school get funding for starting up an esports program? How do you take facilitators at a school who don't really have an understanding of the game, but still create a meaningful program for high school students where they're learning the same values of like teamwork, communication, leadership in the same way that a sports program would, but without knowing the nitty gritty and the intricacies of the game. Then it's like for kids and students, it's like, okay, if you are now part of an esports program in high school or college, how do you showcase and build a portfolio of the skills that you've learned for colleges that you're applying to or even job opportunities, right? So there's a lot of different things you can do in like those spaces that I feel like are low hanging fruit and just need to have like a very base model. And then on the data side, it's a lot about how you work with different data groups. So Riot, while I think that there's a lot of room to grow, they've actually done a really great job of partnering with Baze for League of Legends and Grid because they're the data
Yep.
providers for competitive, right? And they have at least API that you can access for looking at non-competitive data. So how much can we pull from it? How can we create like a good relationship with publishers, and what projects can third parties create to and share with the community to enable other publishers, a non-Riot, to also be more open with the data that they have, so it can kind of help fuel and benefit the ecosystem. So those are like the short-term projects that I have in 2023.
It's very clear in your answer, and I think this is one of the things that even at times when your former employer and I were at odds, I really respected about you is that you tend to think very broad, and I think it's helpful that like your background before you worked at TSM, for those unfamiliar, you worked at Boeing, like you had professional experience outside of this industry before coming into this industry as professional, even though you were also, I would say, one of the early people, especially to League of Legends, but also just generally more to esports as a professional. And so it's clear, like listening to that answer, that a lot of your thinking is kind of bigger and broader in the same way that it was always. I want to ask kind of a two-part question on that based off what you just said. The first is like your overall thoughts on the state of where esports is right now, because we've talked to a lot of professionals on the show that like generally feel like there is a correction period now. It's very clear in all the financial data. The audience size is probably not as hyper engaged as like Newzoo and other data companies would like you to believe or have probably previously said in their own reports. Where do you think the industry is right now? And specifically, I want your thoughts on like broader than just the actual professional level of the industry, exactly what you're talking about, which is like the sort of collegiate high school, like where you breed passion for these things that eventually feed into the professional. Where do you think we're at?
So when you talk about esports, you mean the professional side, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very strictly competitive video gaming, right? Because like a lot of people like will say esports and they mean streaming or they mean gaming in general. It's like no. Those are two creators and casual gamers are two very different audiences. I'm talking about the people that play competitive games and watch competitive games very specifically.
Yeah. So the first part is, I mean, there is a winter coming. One of my friends describes it as economic Darwinism, and that's what's going to happen in the next 2.5 years. It's organizations who have taken the large amounts of funding that they were able to raise in the last 5 or so years, were they able to capitalize on it and build something out for themselves, right? And so I think of professional esports, and the entire reason anyone would want to be in it is to create fandom, right? You want to take the capital that you get, and you want to invest it into teams. When you do that, you obviously have viewership, and that's what kind of drives the value of the game. Both it's a function of viewership and how easy it is to monetize. And that's why you see where, even though maybe Apex may not have as many viewers, I do think that ecosystem is easier to monetize than other games. And so I do think it's a function of those two things. It's like, okay, so the first part is raise capital, get into a place where you're competing and having viewers. And then the next step is, through a combination of performance and creative, how do you take some of those viewers away and make them fans of your team and your organization? Because that's how I think you can distinguish yourself from other orgs and monetize the fans, right? Because I think while viewers watch the game, fans care about you and buy your things and provide value to you specifically. So I think the orgs who are able to create the best, the most, I think, fans in a way, and combine them with either long-term partnerships with either sponsors or had their own business lines that they're helping support, are the ones who are going to be able to survive, right? And the teams who didn't do that are, I think, the ones who are going to be looking to sell, looking to get out and go find something else to do. So I think that's where we're kind of at right now. I think a lot of people who, depending on what their burn rate was and how much they had in their war chest when in the last couple of years, depending on how they spent it, the people who have built up good assets are going to try to survive, and the people who haven't are going to try to look for a way out. And I think it's good for the industry overall, this correction, because it means that the people who were able to build the proper businesses in this ecosystem with alongside publishers and everything else in it, the ones who are left standing and the ones who enter now, which is going to be interesting, are going to make it's going to be like professional esports 2.0 at the end of this winter. So I think it's beneficial for this scene, even though it may seem rough for the next couple of years.
A follow-up on that is that a lot of the esports businesses are not esports businesses anymore at their core. You're like TSM, your former employer, is a good example of this, and they were actually pretty early to investing in things that were different than just the hardcore competitive teams. They got into the tech space really aggressively. The old like solo mid website that was sort of like Twitch directory at some point, and a more effective Twitch directory in a lot of instances as well, with embeds. And then, obviously they had a bunch of the different League of Legends guides websites that are really popular. Eventually they acquired Blitz and they integrated some of that technology into Blitz. They've acquired the Dino bot, which is a Discord bot that helps with moderation, and they are according to Forbes, the most valuable team in all of esports. And that it's striking to me that you think about them, you think about other people in the space. And there was a Forbes story this past week about FaZe Clan and sort of some of the monetization issues they're having, especially because they're so advertising reliant. And the reporter for that was on a podcast this week, and he basically said, like, esports businesses are no longer esports businesses, and like that, that's not how you proceed forward. So I'd love your thoughts on kind of like that, because we see it with every team. Every team is becoming far and far less reliant on advertiser dollars and less reliant on their competitive teams.
I mean, I think no esport team in this current ecosystem, or even before this current ecosystem, can only be an esports business, because compared to traditional sports where no one owns the IP, like the people who build the good businesses who can band together and operate in a free market can shape the direction of where to take the esport. Whereas right now, it's the publishers who decide where it's going to be broadcast, how it's going to be able to be monetized, what the restrictions are, and they have like a clear goal for themselves, right? Like they want to sell the most skins, or want like the casual players to buy the most in game, right? And they also have to cater to a global audience and not necessarily local or regional leagues. And so when you have a large force like this in the ecosystem that governs every aspect of your business, you can't solely rely on the esports side to run your business. And so, yeah, I do think that no esports team should be purely an esports team. They have to diversify in some way. Like you've seen 100 Thieves who have come in and done it, and they've like obviously started building out their own business lines through Juby. They've acquired High Ground. TL has their approach. C9 has their approach. Every smart team has diversified and figured out their own way that they can make it so their business relies on things outside of individual involvement in individual titles, which is also why they have to diversify the number of esports titles they're in. Because if you just rely on winning one title, that is not a long-term strategy that you want to go for. Because again, no esport, I think right now you can say, is multi-generational.
That's right. Yeah, I think that, I'm wearing the shirt, but I had a really interesting experience going to the League of Legends World Championship in Atlanta, the semifinal. And I went as a fan. I didn't ask Riot for the press credential. I would have gotten it if I did, but I didn't want to. I just wanted to enjoy it. It's not really my job to cover events like that anymore. And I had a really interesting experience sitting next to a group of guys who were like buddies, who were basically what I would call like lapsed League of Legends fans. So like they were talking about, that they hadn't paid attention to League of Legends esports since 2013, 2014, 2015. But that, they had recently, they all had families, got married, whatever gone on. They were all in their like mid 30s ish and moved on in their lives. And then, because they're from the Southeast, they all came together and went to this event because it has that sort of like old place in their heart. And I actually think there's a lot more of those than we might realize as an industry of people who like, those aren't the people that watch LCS every day now, like during the regular season. They're the people that watch Worlds. It's the same analogy as I've used it several times on the show. It's the same analogy of like, you can't use the outliers like the Super Bowl and, the World Cup or whatever to measure interest in soccer. You can't use World Cup viewership to validate MLS viewership, basically. Like it's not 1-to-1. And unfortunately, I think the industry's done that a lot, actually, to demonstrate interest in a way that's maybe not right.
I mean, that's another big reason why the mission of Sido is so, if I do everything right with Sido over the next 2 to 5 years, I hope there's more spaces for guys that you just met, right? I'm like an adult now. I'm past 30, and so I'm gonna maybe have kids, right? If they have kids, I want the high school that they go to have an esports program, right? I want them to share that part of me when I was growing up. I want to go to like little league games. I want them to like potentially try different games. I want to express the things that I loved and the things that I learned from the things that I loved growing up, within the context of whatever they're going to be doing. It may not be the same titles that they're going to be playing. There might be new titles, new genres, even new ways of consuming and engaging with gaming. But I do hope that um, that community that needs to be built out in the US, because it's only through that where it's only by having like a life cycle of someone who grows up on a game, like gets married, has kids, and has a place to still engage with that game in every different way, that's gonna make it so the first esport becomes multi-generational.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because we've not, at least to present, we've not really seen any of those businesses quite work. You know, like I'll limit what I say in disclosure. You know, they're a partner of ours on a project, but like we're partnered with Nurture Gamers on something we're working on at the moment. And I look at businesses like theirs, I look at businesses like Belong Arenas, I look at businesses like Play Versus and eFuse and some of the others, and like no one's figured out like sort of the youth esports thing. In concept, it's a really cool idea. To be able to engage more young people. They're already playing games. This is a generation of people who like almost all of them play some sort of game, be it very casually or very aggressively. But I don't think anybody's figured out the model that quite works. I don't think arenas is the right model, at least yet, because I don't think it's enough at scale. And it's not like, like the population density and, sort of internet connectivity is not the same as it is in Asia where that model does work, etc. It's interesting. I sort of love your take on like what you think has to change. Do you think it's just that basically just that these kids just need to grow up that are playing games right now, and a portion of them will get into hardcore gaming as a result? Or what is the solution for like more youth engagement and sort of more serious gaming activity?
Sure. I think that the urgency with which you speak about what this ecosystem needs to be, I think if you look at like a traditional sport and how long it takes for like a sport to mature, right? It takes decades. I think we've only seen like one true decade in the United States of like esports being mainstream, and we're kind of naturally drawn, and we think of how advanced, or at least how much money is in the pro side, and we just expect everything under the ecosystem
Well,
to also be as
that's
built
the
up.
problem, right? Is like the problem is if you make a comparison to the NFL or the NBA or any of the other traditional sports, is that they scaled with time. Like, yeah, there were stupid investments along the way, but like nobody put the skis before the Stokes, and like it was over time that they built up and the expectations built up. Whereas this feels like it's like on the professional side of esports that there was like such a significant amount of financial activity between 2015 and 2021 that like the expectations rose through the roof, right? And now it feels like the industry's trying to play catch up with it. I think that's why it builds that sense of urgency.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's I think the second part is like, and I think people will slowly start to understand. It's like, yeah, like you said, first it's going to be about people who grew up in this generation, growing up and having their own kids and figuring it out. The other part is going to be less of a focus on players and more about the people around the players, right? And so one clear example of this, and I've talked to the right folks about Game Changers. I think Game Changers is an amazing initiative. They're supporting women players who want to kind of take the next step and providing them like a context and place to play, right? But my argument to them is like, if you really want to promote women in esports, it has to be more than just players. It has to be women in management positions. It has to be women coaches. Right. It has to be women journalists. Like, you have to support every other pocket of the ecosystem, and it's the same thing that's happened on the scholastic side too. Every group who I know is trying to make youth esports work focuses very heavily on the player and player retention and getting those guys in, and they don't focus anything on the parents, right? Like, they don't provide help for the parents, any conversations with them. They don't help. They don't figure out a way to connect with the facilitators and the teachers around them, because those are the two most important stakeholders in like a child's life. And if you want to involve players, you have to connect with the people around those players so they can support them. And I think that's one of the key things that's missing. And it's like, how do you connect the people around those? How do you give the people who are participating in the program a step to the next side And right now, most people try to be like, oh, we're going to support these players, they're going to make the jump to pro. No, there needs to be additional steps. If a player isn't good enough to go pro, like, are there community programs that they can go to? Can you go to play in college? If they can't play in college, can you go coach in college? Can you do like a journalism degree while doing like a collegiate, like an esports focus? There just needs to be more context built around this idea of competitive gaming, and more people that need to be involved in being the stakeholders.
Yeah, I feel like generally you're more optimistic than I am. I mean, at least my sort of like my read on the trend is that it's a core function of why I'm making the career pivot I am, and I've talked about this on the show, is that like esports has a storytelling problem, and I think that that is incredibly related to part of the interest issue, in the sense of like, when I think about League of Legends, for example, and you've worked with both of these players, so you understand why I'm about to say this. When I think about League of Legends in America, there are two players to me that have compelling stories that you could translate to the mainstream. That like you could build like a piece of content around that goes, if somebody watched it on a Netflix or a Hulu or whatever, they would get it, and they wouldn't have to know the game. And that is Bjergsen and Doublelift. That's it. And then, the context for that, Bjergsen has like this sort of like young prodigy story of, coming to the US and building this career for himself after being from Europe. And Doublelift has a very up-down, relationship with his family, and a very tragic story with his older brother murdering his mother and severely harming his father. After he started to rebuild that relationship, he became sort of the dominant player in the region. It's two players in a field of 50 plus on the professional side of things. And I think that in particular is one of the biggest reasons that I think sort of the younger audience, the late Zoomers, early Gen Alphas, don't care about esports maybe as much as sort of the older Zoomers and the younger, the late millennials did, because they're more interested in streamers. Streamers are compelling. They are personalities, right? And I think the numbers kind of show that, the growth in streaming over the past 2 years, especially during the pandemic and people being inside and isolated. And so I think that's sort of where a little bit of my like pessimism comes from, in the sense of like to get people into this industry, you got to be able to tell stories. That's like super, the most important part. And you shouldn't have to, a lot of people have been like, oh, the story of Deft and Faker at the World Championship, they went to high school together. Like, that's a cool story. Don't get me wrong. But you have to have literally a decade plus of context of like those guys' career to understand all of the like meat and potatoes, and it's something that other niche sports have done very, very well to explain, like Formula One with Drive to Survive, like wrestling with Dark Side of the Ring, and some of these other content pieces that are more accessible to non-gaming audiences. It's something I don't think esports has done well at all.
I would say that it's not something that esports has done well recently. I do think that esports did it fairly well before the large influx of investment that came into the scene. If you thought of the scene back in like 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, you knew players more than just Doublelift or Bjergsen. You knew the Wild Turtle, you knew the Afro, you knew a lot of other people in the space, because back then, I think, again, we were talking about pre-investment era, every team, every org had to run like a very sustainable business, right? There was no franchising, there was still the threat of relegation. You had to go out and get your sponsorships. Players weren't paid very well, and so they took that opportunity where, when they became a pro player, to start streaming, building their brand. It was a core identity for all orgs and all players to be able to do that, right? And I think many of them did tell compelling stories. The problem, and what I think happened, is when a lot of investment dollars came in, every team recognized that in order to get the largest piece of the fandom pie, they needed to win. And so I think performance became super heavily indexed in. And I think a lot of people on the LCS and the esports side kind of forgot the soul of what esports is, which is connecting to fans and fandom and telling the stories. And I can see why you'd be pessimistic, because I am too. I also think that the streaming side is a lot easier industry to work in, and it's super easy for them to connect with their fans. But I have to be optimistic, because esports is something that I care about. And I think the pessimist is probably right more often than not, but it's hopefully the optimist that changes the world. I don't
Good
know.
tagline.
There's that saying, right? And so, I do think that we can go back to a place where if we take the longer view of what esports can be, build out the supporting parts of the industry that have been neglected for a long period of time, I do think that esports in the next 10 years is going to be in a much more stable place than it is right now.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I'm generally still very passionate about it as a fan, but like,
Yeah.
kind of call the balls and strikes, which I've kind of always done unpopularly in my career, and I've been right about a lot of them. So I think it's important.
I mean, just think about it this way, right? Like, I think the world is becoming more digital every day, right? No one can deny that.
Yeah.
And I think it is human nature to be competitive. And I think if you combine those two areas together, esports in some capacity is going to exist in the future.
Oh,
It might not
absolutely.
be,
Yeah.
Yeah, it might not be in the same event, not in the same way it did now, but like last weekend I was watching Ludwig's event and they did Smash Boxing, right? Maybe it'll be like a hybrid, like physical sports, esports combo. Like, who knows what esports is going to be like in the future, but it is going to exist in some way.
I think it will be incredibly, I think it will be incredibly personality driven. Like, I think, sort of looking
it has to be.
Yeah, in terms of, a buddy of mine is the creator and CEO of the game Rushdown Revolt, and he sponsored the Smash or Scuffed World Tour Ludwig event this past weekend.
Yeah.
Threw them some extra dollars to kind of help them offset some cost, and they plugged him, and he got literally double the player engagement that he got off of Evo, which is like, and he was an official Evo title this year, which is like,
yeah,
get real here for a minute. The fact that like, sort of one person can drive that much value to something.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, esports is going to change, and I do think that it does come from how do you tell the stories of these players, and right now, personalities can do them a lot better than professional leagues.
Yeah.
So there is going to be some level of merging that's going to happen in the next 10 years, but esports will continue to grow for sure.
Yeah, I think it's for the better. And the other thing, part of that too, is just that like advertising, paid media advertising is down right now across the board. It's partly because of there's a lot of different issues, whether it be like, a result of some of the supply chain issues we've seen across a lot of industries, whether it be inflation and sort of access to capital is more difficult right now. It's harder to get debt, etc. And so like budgets are being a lot more strict at a lot of the consumer product places. And, ultimately like that's not just affecting esports, that's affecting the entire sort of entertainment world. Right? Sports is feeling some of that effect too. Traditional sports is feeling some of that effect as well. And so yeah, it's an industry that I'm very interested to kind of see how it nets out. I think it will be a tough couple of years. I think the other thing too is that it doesn't play favorably to short form media quite yet. I've seen a lot of like esports teams and a lot of sort of third-party esports media companies put time into like TikTok and YouTube Shorts, and it's awful. It's just bad. Like, it's not, it's funny because we've had some success on those platforms, but it's when we have like Slime, Ludwig's manager, educating me on a sex toy and how he used Ludwig's money to buy it, like Ludwig's company money to buy it, and they got in an argument over it, or like Ludwig, making a D's nuts joke on the show towards Sea of Thieves developer, like. That is great for short form when you can make that condensed under 60 seconds, but like an esports game or whatever, it just doesn't cut it.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, it's a culture thing, right? I do think that there's a place for both. There is a place for people who enjoy like the really competitive aspect of someone who has spent like years of his life dedicating his craft towards something. And can showcase it in front of people. And there's the other one where it's like, oh, it's like a person who is so easy to connect with, and you just want to kind of sit down and like chat with them, right? There are two different spheres of entertainment, or there's a lot, but those are the two conflicting ones right now. And I do think that they're both going to have their own spaces.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think it will go away. And you're right, gaming interest is only growing. It's funny you mentioned sort of Riot and their control over the League of Legends ecosystem. I think in the past year, or 13, 14 months, however long it's been, Riot has both done the best piece and probably worst piece for gaming mainstream adaptation and sort of interest. And what I say by best is Arcane. Arcane did a fantastic job. If you're listening to this and you've not watched it, I encourage you. Riot does not pay for anything on this program, but it is a very good animated show on Netflix, and it did a good job of, it rewarded the people who, like you and I, who have played that game for a decade, but it was accessible to people who had never touched it. You know, I listened to a lot of like comic fan podcasts, anime nerds, etc., and a lot of those people were talking about Arcane, and they have zero interest in League. It activated a huge new section of audience for the sort of the lore and the ecosystem. When I say worst, I mean players. The sort of mockumentary esports style thing. I know a lot of people in our industry love it and want to support it, and I really like the people that made it. But at the same time, it's like one of the most inaccessible things I've seen, having watched it all. And, you know, they sold like 30 plus sponsorships, I believe, against it. And it just like feels like commercial vomit, basically, compared to Arcane, which feels like a labor of love to the universe. So it's interesting.
I mean, it was like you can think of them as one was supposed to appeal to the broader audience, and the others almost felt like a love story too. It felt like it was meant to be an inside joke for the people who were in the industry. I personally haven't seen players yet, even though everyone keeps
free on YouTube now. They put it up like last week or something.
I don't want to relive it, so it's like a lot of inside jokes and stories, and I just like, I don't know if I want to like see what things were like back then. I'm sure I'll watch it at some point, but yeah, no, I think to the broader point you were trying to make, I think Riot's actually done. I criticize Riot a lot, but it's because I think in many ways they're still doing a lot more for the industry than a lot of the other publishers. Like,
sure,
they made a lot of mistakes, but I appreciate that they make the mistakes because at least they learn and fix them over a period of time, to a certain degree. You know, I think this 12 months they've actually done a lot of good things. They cut off their relationship with Playversus to a degree. They
done a lot of reporting
things
on
like
that.
Arcane and Players. They loosened the restrictions on the high school and community programs and collegiate side in terms of what they could do and the sponsorships they can get. So they loosened a lot of restrictions. I think they partnered with the Xbox for the Game Pass thing.
They did,
too. So like, I do think that they've, like, for all the flack they're getting on like the pro league side, I think they've done enormous good for the ecosystem the past 12 months.
Yeah, I think the thing is that more than any other publisher, esports and sort of hardcore gaming, even if not people that are playing it competitively, is a core tenet of their, you know, sort of thing, for better or for worse. You know, like there was recently a lot of talk because of a Hard Times, which is like a parody gaming publication, article about like you having to play a game as a part of your interview process. They actually make you do that, make you play League to get a job at Riot, or ask you if you play League, which feels like sort of an inappropriate question on an interview. And it's not the first time I've heard it critiqued generally, but you know, they for better or for worse, people there top to bottom do care about sort of the hardcore space, and it is it's so they do. My point being, they have so much activity catering to those people that some of it's going to be good and some of it's going to be bad. So it's like it's just because they do so much. Like, you know, they just do it way more in volume. You mentioned Playversus there in your answer. You're talking to the reporter here who's broken a lot of stories on that company this year. For those kind of unfamiliar that haven't read the rest of my reporting work, this is a company that has raised, I'm forgetting the exact number, $100+ million in venture capital, was valued at $400+ million. And notably, you know, their CEO has sort of this, it's a movie type story of being sort of a black founder from Detroit who does not come from much, and then was able to start this high school esports company inside of an incubator in California that he got accepted to. He got a partnership with the National Federation of High Schools, which is the governing regulations body for thousands of schools across America, and on the traditional sports side. And then he got a ton of licenses from the likes of Riot and others to be their de facto operating body for, you know, high school esports. What's changed this year, as Parth was alluding to, is that Riot basically they revoked their license to be the exclusive person for high school esports. They opened the ecosystem for other people to come in. They had been telling people that they had an exclusive license to Activision Blizzard games, and they did not, according to reporting for the Washington Post. I also reported this year that they allegedly, according to 7 former employees that I spoke with, misled Epic Games, creators of Fortnite, about player numbers, and that there were known not players that were not high school and collegiate players playing in collegiate and high school tournaments that they were running, and they were reporting them to Epic to sort of make the numbers bigger. They deny those allegations for what it's worth, but the former employees spoke to that. And then also they were in a labor lawsuit this summer with a former employee who they allegedly fired for being pregnant, is what she alleged in the lawsuit, and that settled out of court. So Parth, thoughts on Playversus now, and seems like they're in an interesting position with all kind of losing all their foothold.
So the day that news kind of hit Twitter and everywhere that they no longer had the exclusive rights, I've never seen a lot of people who don't get along band together to in like celebration. Um, I think that I mean, I think all those stories that you broke are really valuable and important. I think the one key piece that I kept hearing during my interactions with the high school and collegiate space in the last year and a half was that parents and like facilitators in high schools wanted to start their own programs. They wanted to do tournaments that made sense for them, for their local communities. And Playversus used to send out emails to them saying that like they would take legal action if they didn't use the Playversus platform that you had to pay for, right? And I think that was one of those things where it's like a group who doesn't understand what's at stake. They don't have like the core values of the space that they're operating in, and I think that's where they lost the battle. I think it was more they lost the battle more on the PR side more so than any other thing that they did, is because they were just universally hated, just hated in the high school and collegiate spaces. So I think if they'd operated slightly better in those cases, even if they had like a subpar product, I feel like they could have still been relevant or bigger than they were today.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I mean, something I'm still actively looking into, for the record, but it's kind of the effects. I've done more reporting on sort of the corporate side of things. You know, my background, a lot of my background is reporting on venture capital and how money moves. And when you raise that much and you're worth, worth 400 plus million, and in an ecosystem where you don't own really any IP other than a matchmaking system, I find that really, really intriguing and something I will continue to watch and pay attention to as well. So, I want to harken back to something I was going to follow up on earlier, which was, we got sort of on a tangent, but I didn't want to interrupt it. We were talking about sort of your like broader, the way that you think about the ecosystem, and at TSM, your roles, you started off there as, I believe you started off as an analyst for the league team, right? And then eventually became its coach, and then you were its general manager, and then you became sort of the general manager for the broader esports organization. That's right? And worked across all of its operations.
Yep. So I feel in many ways lucky to have joined TSM at the time I did, even though I didn't know it at the time. I remember I joined as an analyst. I used to share a 10 by 10 bedroom with Max, who was the main driver behind TSM Legends back in the day. It was a different world back then,
Mm-hmm.
When I then initially in 2016, I wanted to transition to management, but ended up in a coaching position. But I had to kind of do both jobs for a year and a half. So I'd be writing sponsorship reports for like Geico at night, wake up in the morning, catch up watching league games, and then plan like the coaching day, right? And so I had the fortune of kind of seeing what the industry was back in the day. I kind of knew the gritty, like what it took to both compete but also run a business, just because I had to play those two roles. And then I got to see what it was like working with Riot, the franchise league, the influx of money. And so I'm lucky to have kind of gone through the entire spectrum of things, and that's why I think I can have that broader view. Whereas I think a lot of people who kind of join the industry now kind of get locked into very specific slots or very specific positions. And most esports orgs haven't figured out a way to connect the different departments yet. Like they don't know, like creative op works in their own different way, like their isolated way. Usually operations is an own isolated system. Coaches and performance is an isolated way. And even every title that most orgs are in are isolated from each other. They don't learn from each other. And I do think that's going to change in the next few years, I hope. I do think that performance is going to go and become like its own thing. And then there's going to be a lot more collaboration, hopefully, on the partnerships and creative side with the titles that they're doing. But yeah, I think that's kind of where my perspective comes from. I just had to do a lot of everything at TSM for a lot of the time I was there.
You know, I wanted to ask you sort of if you felt limited at the end, and because clearly now, like explaining what you're doing with Sido, some of the other work that you're doing, it's clear that you're getting to explore a lot of your passions. But you know, TSM went from when you started, you were just talking about having to do kind of be the wearer of many hats and do so many different things. By the time you left, it was this, you know, $500+ million company that is like sort of way more rigid in the way that it does things, and it is sort of slower moving. It's like every startup. As soon as they start to formalize more, it becomes less where there's people like you that can be flexible like that. And for most people, that's relieving, but right, because it's the ability to like take less stress off your plate, not have to focus anymore. I feel like as long as I've known you, though, you've been like passionately curious, right? And so you've wanted to do so many different things. Did you feel like towards the end that you were sort of like stuck, and is that was part of your decision to leave?
I did feel that. There were a lot of things. I think that it was the combination of TSM moving from like a more startup environment to a more business oriented focus on structure and operations and all of that. That transition usually happens for most orgs, right? That grow at that scale this quickly. And it also a lot of that also happened during COVID, where you never got to see like the new faces come on, replacing the connections that you had to the people who left. And so I care deeply for the people that I work with and work for. And so that's something that I started to miss over a period of time. The next thing was kind of like, I did feel like I was very limited in the things that I could do, not only in terms of what I could do for TSM, but also I saw the same problems every year, right? Like you would try to find the best imports, try to put in the coaches. The coaches would then try to win every game in the season because it was really important, because that's how you were kind of judged on broadcast. Like performance mattered a lot. You went to Worlds. Obviously, North American teams had a severe disadvantage in a lot of different ways. Couldn't really get too far at Worlds. You'd have to give that speech at the end thing like, hey, we're gonna focus on like the long-term thing. We're gonna invest in talent and come back next year. But like it was just the same cycle over and over again. And I realized that I can't solve the problems that I saw by being part of an esports org, regardless of whether or not it was TSM or somewhere else. I think the problems that need to be solved, again, at the ecosystem level, the solutions have to come outside of people working at esports, because esports teams do have to operate under certain timescales, and are beholden to their investors, and they have to operate in a certain way. And if you want to have a more long-term approach to esports and building this out, you can't do it within the scope of an esports team.
You know, notably, TSM has had a rough year the past year. Last December, about a year ago, Wired reported that Riot had opened an investigation into its founder, your former boss, Andy Din, and his CEO, for alleged abusive behavior. There was a lot of reporting over the past 8 months from the Washington Post and from Wired, and Cecilia D'Anastasio and Mikhail Clementos specifically. I think I should give them a shout out. Cecilia's been on the show. And yeah, they reporting around sort of Din's behavior and the way that he treated employees and managed relationships with the employees. And additionally as well, with some issues around independent contractors being misclassified, etc. Riot's ultimate investigation came out, and they said while he had not done anything illegal, that they had found evidence of sort of mistreatment and what they would consider like, you know, sort of workplace misconduct on the sort of culture and abuse side of things. You worked with this person for a long time. I want to ask you kind of what your thoughts, especially because you were gone for sort of this investigation portion of things.
Sorry, what was the last bit?
I was going to say, I want to ask you for your thoughts because you were gone for a lot of this investigation, but I kind of want your thoughts as someone that worked there for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I left right as the investigation was just starting, or right before. Um, I don't really have much to say. I have a very complicated relationship with TSM, Andy, and everyone that's there. Um, I think I had a lot of good experiences there and a lot of tough ones. Taught me a lot of lessons. And I don't know if there's anything more that I can say without having to actually go into more detail. So I think I'll just leave it at that.
Understood. You also recently, though, announced that, and I was kind of surprised at this because you and I connected kind of off the record earlier in the year, because I was just kind of, you were curious what I was doing, I was curious what you were doing, and sort of where you were going to go from here. And it was announced recently that you were consulting for Immortals and working with their League of Legends team. I have two questions about that. I guess the first is like, what are you doing for them? What is your involvement in that?
Sure. So they were in a position where I think it was very close to free agency. It was, I think, towards the end of October, and at that point, they didn't have a director of esports, they didn't have a GM, and they didn't literally have too much of a direction of what was going on. I've made a connection through a couple of my investors, and I met their CEO, and they just asked if I could kind of consult and help them rebuild, and I told them like, hey, I'm down to do this, but I think you have to approach this slightly differently. I think when teams operate, like everyone has two constraints, like they have time constraints and they have budget constraints, and they have to do the best they can with those things in mind. And for me, I think the thing that most teams have done incorrectly in the LCS is that regardless of the budget and time constraints, they've spent their money in the exact same way, which is they try to get the best talent they can, and they surround them with resources that are kind of inadequate, and they just try to do the best that they can, and they rinse and repeat, right? They have this metric of like, how many wins did I get for the amount that I spent? And that's the metric that I think a lot of teams kind of look internally, and they're proud, like, oh, look, I spent this much less than this team and still got this many wins. And I'm like, this that doesn't really make sense. If you're gonna do something meaningful, then you have to build something from scratch. And so I walked them through an idea of like, okay, here's how you kind of build a staff. You have to look at the different competencies of what you want to be a coaching staff and how you can support your players. You should still do the things that will best benefit the players that you have. So, for example, if you have a team of veterans and 5 players who are looking to win every game in the split, win spring, go to MSI, come back, win summer, go to Worlds, that team should be training in a different way than a team who has 2 rookies and is like the idea of periodization is very common in sports, but it does not exist in esports. And I'm like, you guys have the opportunity to try something new in terms of how you build your staff, how you run this program, and you can take 1 year, take a step back, and instead of burning all of your cash on trying to get the best players, try to build a good program first and see what you can do to build on it. So my relationship with Immortals is pretty much working with the staff, helping them develop, learning new ways to, helping them try out new ideas and ways to train, and helping kind of their leadership, explaining to them. So by the end of the year, I expect Immortals to have like a long list of like SOPs that they can operate in terms of like how to try out players, how to bring on staff, how to run a boot camp, something that they can basically take and build upon. So that's kind of my relationship with them. It was a very unique one because, again, they're a team that without a lot of expectations, and so there's a lot of room to experiment, try new things, and like share those lessons with the community, which is why I was kind of interested in them compared to any other team.
Well, and I don't mean offense to the people there personally. They've been at least very kind to me as a reporter and answering my questions when I have them. But they also seem like a team that, if you had to go down the list of LCS teams, they seem like one of the teams that's a little checked out from this. I've done a little bit of reporting in the sense that they a lot of their investors are looking for whatever the exit opportunity is, and it just hasn't come up because maybe the assets are not as valuable as they were raised on previously. We've seen them as a business offload the Los Angeles Valiant, their Overwatch League team, to a third party. They had previously made the huge acquisition of Optic and bought into the Call of Duty League as well a few years ago. That's now gone. That got sold off, both the brand and the spot. It seems that they're very lean. Was that a concern with you, working with a team that sort of seems it's not like FlyQuest or TSM or C9 or Liquid, who are like, even if they're making a slight correction to their budget, they are still in a way kind of doubling down and still like hyper committed to this. Immortals is not exactly that.
I don't really know what the behind the scenes is in terms of what they want to do with their business. I only know like the scope of what I have to do with them, which is the great thing about forming Sido, right? I can now just focus on very specific things, and I don't have to worry and stress about the impact in the overall business. I have a I have a period of time that I'm working with them. I have very specific goals and KPIs, and I'm kind of running with them, right? I'm really happy with the staff and what they're trying, and I do think that the ecosystem, I hope, learns a lot of lessons from the things that Immortals ends up trying this year, in terms of like how to train and how to coach and how to build programs. So that's my goal at the end of the day. In terms of like how they want to run their business and what their goals are with it, I'm not super privy to those conversations.
I do want to ask, though, because when we spoke earlier this year, it didn't seem like that was your immediate thought. So to go back to League, and I want to ask if it feels like, with everything else you're doing that like you seem very driven and passionate about with Sido and all the other projects you're working on, does it feel like in a way a step back to be working with a League team in any way?
Not really. I mean, I think at most I'm going to be spending. So I worked with them earlier this year, like a month or so ago, for like a boot camp, and I helped kind of set them up. For the most part, I'll be spending an hour or two max per day, like maybe like 5 or 10 hours per week remotely, kind of advising their coaching staff and management, right? So it's not like a big time commitment for me, and I do think that there's a lot of value in and like a very unique spot like that. I actually think I'd be a lot less happy if I was just like in a random middle of the pack team who's doing like everything the same way. They're going in, they're playing like 5 or 6 days of scrims, they're doing draft in the same way, they're going back and reviewing and rinse and repeating, right? I think this is like an opportunity to do something new and interesting. And so and I also think that the things that we're doing also overlap in things that I wanted to kind of showcase anyway. And this is just the lens through which I can do that and share the stories. So it's easy for me to say like, oh, I think training periodization should be done like this way in League of Legends, right? It's another for me to like work with a team who is incentivized to try it and then share the lessons of like, hey, when we say something like maybe don't scrim as much, try to do drills or practices in a certain way. This is how the players took it. These are the challenges that the coaching staff hit when they were trying it. This is what happened when other teams didn't want to practice with you in the same way, and you have to scrim in an academy team instead. These are the lessons we learned. These are the constraints behind it. I do think that there's a value in applying some of the things that I'm saying in this context, and then being able to share that with the community.
We're running up on time. I want to ask you this because, again, harkening back to that thoughtfulness, if you had to have a prediction right now about what is going to happen in the industry, the esports industry more specifically over the next 3 to 5 years, what would be your kind of big scale prediction?
3 to 5 years is really hard because you don't know what the long-term effects of this winter are going to be. We don't know if it's going to be like just 2-year dip and then it's going to go right back up. You don't know if it's going to go down and just like stabilize. So it's really hard for me to say what the predictions are going to be on the professional side. But I do think that when we do exit this freeze, the set of teams and organizations that are going to be there are going to be much stronger to face like the next decade of esports and more equipped than the people who raised a shit ton of money 5 years ago.
That's fair. It will be interesting. I mean, I hope the best for the industry. I hope the best for you and kind of what you're doing with Sido as well. I will It's hard. I think, like we mentioned earlier in this episode, it's tough in a sense of when the industry's expectations are so high. Everything else feels down from there, right? Like none of it was measured, and so it's even if it is like more stable and a healthier business in 5 years because things went down and they like found their way towards the bottom or like in the middle. It's hard when there was all the press and all the talk that was like, you know, how this was the next big thing, and I don't think that's true, at least not yet.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you very much, though, for joining me on this. I appreciate you coming on. We hope everybody has a happy holiday, and thank you again, Parth, for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Take it easy.
Thanks for watching Visionaries on YouTube. For more content, please subscribe to the Overcome channel.